Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video on this channel. This time it's another one about Waypoint, but instead of deploying to Kubernetes, we'll deploy to Google Cloud Run. Now, if you have never worked with Google Cloud Run before, it's just a service that Google provides on the Google Cloud Platform that allows you to deploy containers. But these containers can be auto-scaled by Google automatically. So basically a serverless model, but you deploy containers instead of doing specific things like with Azure Functions or Google Cloud Functions and so forth. If you have never worked with Google Cloud Run, of course you should get an account on the Google Cloud Platform. You can get, I think, something around $300 free credit if you sign up for the first time. And then if you get access to the Google Cloud Platform, to the console, you can go to Compute, you can go to Cloud Run, and if you're not using Waypoint, you can just click on Create Service. And it's really very easy. You follow a couple of steps here, and you can deploy your service. In this case, he's asking for what development platform to use. Now we're going to use the fully managed Cloud Run environment, which is not run on some kind of Kubernetes cluster. That would be Cloud Run for Anthos. We're not going to use that. You would type in a service name, just typing in test here. I want to allow anyone on the internet to connect to this service. And then in the next steps, logically, we would select a container image URL. Now be aware that that should then be a container image URL from the container registry of Google. In this case, there are some demo containers and so forth that you can select. These are some containers that I already deployed or saved into the container registry. So of course, an important step when we are deploying our service with Waypoint is that we also build and push a container to the Google Container Registry. Of course, once you select an image URL, you can also set some advanced settings. We can do things such as memory allocation, CPU allocation, setting request timeouts, and so forth. And also, that's quite important, the actual auto scaling. We can go to 1,000 instances here. I will put it to a little bit less than that. You'll see later how that is done from Waypoint. Of course, it's not the point that we are going to create this service in a UI. We're going to create this service using Waypoint. Now to do so, of course, you need to install the G Cloud or the Google Cloud SDK on your system. So G Cloud has to be installed. That's very similar to, for example, with Azure, you have to have the Azure CLI installed. Now the Waypoint documentation for the Google Cloud Run aspects, they contain information about how to install the Google Cloud SDK, how to authenticate to Google Cloud, and also how to configure your Docker environment to be able to push to the Google Cloud Registry. So there are a couple of things you have to do before, of course, Waypoint can actually deploy to Google Cloud. The G Cloud basically has to be configured and you have to be authenticated properly to do so. I did that, but I'm not going to show that in this video. That is something that you can find in the documentation from Waypoint. So let's clear this out and let's show you what we already deployed. So we deployed this service here. When I click on it, you'll see that there are a couple of revisions. Google Cloud Run can work with revisions. There is, in this case, there are two revisions. One is active, receives 100% of traffic. The other one is not active. With the manage traffic option in Google Cloud Run, you can specify how the traffic should be routed. This is something that Waypoint will do for us automatically. So what will happen is if you deploy a new version of your container, that one will be deployed, and then during the release phase, that newly deployed container gets 100% of traffic. Your old container gets 0% of traffic, and an older version, then the older versions, because they only keep two versions, they are pruned from the system automatically. So they make sure that there are two revisions online, and you can go and check out your older revision using a Waypoint URL. As we'll see in a moment. We'll see in a moment how this is actually done. The application, of course, can be reached, the released application, using a Google Cloud Run URL. So if I click on that URL, what I will see is I will see that there is a function app running on that. Now, they have to spin up the container now because it's actually running 0 instances. Now it's spun up, and indeed, if I'm checking the container, it gives me just a message like "Hello, dear Geert," and we're going to actually modify that dear. We're going to remove that and see what the result is in our new app. So basically, that's how it's done. Good. Now let us go to the code. And indeed, in the code, let's first of all modify this dear here and just say hello here. We're going to save this. And this is just an Azure function, and there's nothing special about it. This is some sample code. It's not about the code. We have modified the code. It's a Git repo as well. We are going to commit our change here. And then we are ready to basically deploy this new version. Now, how is this new version deployed with Waypoint? Well, let's check out the Waypoint HCL. Because if you watch the previous videos, you know that you need this file here to define your project and to define one or more apps within your project. An app can have labels, fine. But in our case, the build phase, what are we doing here? Well, first of all, we're saying use Docker, which basically means, hey, use the Docker file that's in the project. An Azure Functions project comes with a Docker file. There is no use here to do something like I'm gonna use a Heroku build pack or something like that, right? We can just use the Docker file right away. When we want to deploy to Google Cloud Run, we have to upload this image that we built to the Google Cloud Registry. We use the registry option for this. It's a Docker type of registry. And the image now, of course, we use the registry URL as well, or name gcr.io, and then the name of your Google Cloud project. So if you look at your Google Cloud environment, this one works with projects. This project is called Cloud Run, but the ID of the project is Keen, Bucksaw, and so forth. So projects are a way to organize your different projects and applications in Google Cloud. This is the one that Google Cloud gave me as an initial project. That's why I also generated that unique ID, so to speak. And we're using that ID, we're using that to specify the project also as a repository name. And here's then the image name. So as a tag, we're using gitref pretty. So not something like latest or a number. Gitref pretty is a supported function, and it uses the commit SHA, the git commit SHA value as the tag. So once this Docker image has been built by Waypoint and pushed to Google Cloud Run, we can deploy to Google Cloud Run. So in the previous video you saw here, we use Kubernetes, and then we used specific parameters that were valid for Kubernetes. Now you have specific parameters, of course, for Google Cloud Run. The project needs to be defined. The location, Europe West 1 for Google, that's Belgium. That's where I'm at, so that's great. My container is running on port 80. Google Cloud Run needs to know that. And by using the capacity option, we can specify the container needs this amount of memory, this amount of CPUs. The maximum request per container is, in this case, 50. And the request timeout is 300. Now I've noticed that in the current version of Waypoint that I'm using, what you can actually specify here is less than what Google Cloud Run supports. That will probably change in the future. For example, I think Google Cloud Run supports 4 CPUs now, but I can only specify 1 or 2 CPUs with Waypoint. That will probably change, right? Now, as I said earlier, Google Cloud Run is doing auto scaling for us. In that respect, it is very different from something like Azure Container Instances, which is not doing auto-scaling. So in the case where the number of requests are over 50 for a container, because I've set that, the max requests, then Google will spin up extra containers to support that load. Scaling can go much higher than 5. I just said max is 5 here. Basically, that's also a bit how I limit how much I'm going to pay for this year and so forth. That's our deployment. And of course, deployment can then be followed by a release. The latest deployed version will then become a release. In the case of Google Cloud Run, you have actually seen this already. The release makes sure that the latest deployment receives 100% of traffic and that we prune some older deployments. So we have made a change in our code. We have our Waypoint HCL. Let's just see what Waypoint Up is doing. And that you have seen in the previous video as well, Waypoint Up is doing all the work of building. In this case, then also, of course, pushing the image to Google Container Registry. Again, I'm using the Waypoint entry point by default here, which gives us the specific Waypoint URLs, gives us possibility to do the logs and to exec into the container. As I said already, you don't have to use this entry point. You can remove it if you want from your container, but during the development phase, it's quite easy to have that in there. Okay, the container has been pushed. Now he's doing deployment. Of course, he sees that I already have deployments, so he has to do some checking here. He will deploy a new revision, so to speak, in Google Cloud Run. And when that is done, he will actually make sure 100% of traffic is going to that. So I'm going to just leave it to deploy. And then after deploy, release. As you can see there, he said, I'm doing some routing changes, waiting for it to be ready. And then probably he'll do some pruning as well, remove the latest one. And there we go. We have our deployment URL, which is, yes, I did some testing already, v16. And our release URL is, of course, a Google Cloud Run URL. If we look at the Waypoint console, you can see it here. It says you just built it. You did a deployment to Google Cloud Run. That's this one. Excuse me. This one, version 16. And this one was deployed to Google Cloud Run. Notice that indeed, yes, Waypoint uses these Waypoint Run URLs that give you access to your deployed service. But of course, the last deployed one and the actual released one, they match up. If we go to this released one, we should see that now we have this yeah, something went wrong here. I'm going to go to Google Cloud Run. Yeah. And that is something that I'm seeing sometimes. It's still early days, right? Sometimes the traffic is not actually shifted to my latest deployed version. So that's why you see that the actual application is still saying hello dear here. Yeah, why is that? Because it's basically going to the old version still. Not sure why that is. I'm not getting let's say information about that in the CLI or in the UI. So well, I'll just modify it myself here, which is normally not necessary. You should do this automatically, but sometimes it just doesn't do it. When we do this now, of course, we are shifting the traffic to our latest deployed version, which means that when I'm doing this, my actual correct code should run. And indeed, it says hello Geert here. I'm just leaving this in the video because it's great that you can also see that there are still some issues that have to be worked out, right? And this is clearly one of those. For some reason, that traffic is not shifted. Of course, the one that says hello dear Geert is still available because I have my revision here, 16. Version 15 is actually this one, the one that is now getting 0% traffic, but I can still reach that. Well, if everything is working properly, of course. So if I'm going to version 15, because that sometimes also does not work, that these waypoint run URLs fail. This one now works, so this is good. I'm going to go to API, hello, and then name equals Geert, and there you should see that he still says hello dear Geert. The dear there is not removed because that's my previous version that is still working there, right? Good. Now, of course, because I have it deployed now using Waypoint, I can use Waypoint logs to check the logs of my, in this case, Azure Functions container, where I can see that indeed these hello functions were triggered. So that's basically good. That's my logs. And I can also exec into this thing here. So Waypoint exec, I can do bash, for instance. And in this case, you will go to deployment v16, giving me the access to the container. But when I do an ls, I can see I'm on that machine. I see the Azure Functions host folder, and I see the Waypoint entry point folder as well. So I can exit this properly and be done with that. So this is it. So you have seen how to deploy using Waypoint and Google Cloud Run. As you have seen, a couple of things which still have to be, let's say, fixed. First of all, that you can use the entire capacity that Google Cloud Run provides, not just 1 or 2 CPUs, but indeed 4 CPUs. You have also seen that Waypoint is using the revisions and should normally shift 100% of traffic to your latest deployed or your released application, but that sometimes doesn't happen. In my case, it didn't happen, and I had to use managed traffic to manually shift 100% of traffic to my latest released application. Normally he's doing it, but sometimes he's not. As I said, it's of course still early for Waypoint, but the basic stuff is of course all working. Great. I hope you enjoyed this shorter video. See you again some other time.